Hello, I'm Professor John Kelly, and this is the Weber Auto YouTube channel. In this episode, we are going to look at the history of General Motors automatic transmission fluids. Now, one important thing to understand about automatic transmission fluids is that they are made from the same base stock oils that your engine oils are made of. They just contain a different additive package that is specific to the transmission that it goes in. Most transmission fluids were dyed red starting in 1967 to aid in leak detection diagnostics. But prior to that, transmission fluids looked just like engine oil. Now, I have received many questions and comments regarding specific transmission fluids and whether or not they were synthetic or synthetic blend or refined crude oil. Let's take a look at this table of information that I put together from document 1509 from the American Petroleum Institute, Annex E, which is base stock oil categories. Now keep in mind that these categories did not even exist until the API put this table together in 1993. Okay, looking at that table in the far left-hand column, base stock oils, there's group 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if you go over to the 6th column, it is the approximate technology starting year. In other words, when was the technology available to make that specific group of base oil? So once again, base oil is what transmission fluid is made from, but then it just has an additive package added in. Same with motor oils. Starts with a base oil and then an additive package. Alright, so notice that Group 1 started in the 1930s. The technology to make what is known as Group 2 base stock oils was not even implemented until 1971 here in the United States. Notice that Group 3 base stock oils were not even available until 1993. Group 4 base stock oils were available as early as 1974 in motor oil, but we didn't use those in transmission fluids until 1989. And notice that Group 5 base stock oil is only used as a blended oil with one of these other groups. So automatic transmission fluid, as they call it, which it really is oil, they only changed the name to fluid so that people would quit pouring motor oil in their transmissions. So the transmission fluids of today can be a blend of several of these groups along with an additive package. Now I want you to notice that in the 7th column, I have listed the automatic transmission fluids that I believe use that technology. And I base that belief on looking at patents, at service bulletins, at fluid specifications that I've been able to find, at SAE documents, at books, at websites, at service information from General Motors, and so on. To the best of my knowledge, that is accurate, but there certainly could be some mistakes there. Notice also there's service intervals in the far right-hand column, and we will get into more details on that here in a few minutes. Now there's also 2 unofficial base stock oil categories listed down below. There's a Group 2 Plus, which is what is referred to as hydro-treated Group 2 oil, which gives it a higher viscosity index. And there's Group 3 Plus base stock oils that were formed from a gas to liquid process. And they have very high viscosity indexes also, as you can see in the 5th column. In regard to viscosity indexes, typically a higher viscosity index number is a better base oil, and it would require less additives to maintain that viscosity. Keep in mind that a transmission fluid is much more than just the base oil that it's made from. It is a complete package of the base oil blend and the additive package combined. Now in this next table, I have rearranged everything by the approximate year that technology was available according to my research. So we will start exploring the General Motors transmission fluids beginning with fluids from the 1930s. Now, in the 1930s, vehicle manufacturers were trying to come up with ways to make driving a vehicle easier. General Motors in 1928 had already released the world's first synchro mesh manual transmission in Cadillacs and LaSalle's, but now they were looking to get rid of the clutch pedal and the clutch disc, and they wanted a transmission that would shift automatically. Well, ironically, the inventor of the manual transmission synchronizer in 1922, Mr. Earl A. Thompson, who helped Cadillac develop the synchromesh transmission, was also working on the project to develop the first automatic transmission for General Motors. He was the team leader. So by 1937, Earl A. Thompson and his team had developed what is known as the automatic safety transmission. And as you can see here from this brochure and these magazine ads, this transmission wasn't quite the automatic transmission that we know today. It still had a clutch disc and a clutch pedal, but what it did do was automatically shift. So they had taken care of one of the two technological issues that they were trying to address, but they still had another issue of the clutch. What do they do to get rid of the clutch? So the automatic safety transmission was available in 1938 and 1939. And if you look at the actual service information from a service manual I purchased online for a 1938 Oldsmobile 6 and 8, notice down here on this lubrication table that it shows that the automatic safety transmission uses the same oil as the engine oil. So in 1938 and 39, it would have been a 30 weight oil, or a SAE 30 oil, like this Mobil oil, gargoyle oil, from the late 30s for summertime driving. And then in the wintertime, when it was colder, they would use SAE 20 oil, because it would have a thinner viscosity. And if it was really cold, notice it says to add some kerosene to thin it out. So the first automatic shifting transmission from General Motors used motor oil as the lubricant. Well, as it turned out, that wasn't a very good idea. The quality of the motor oils back then weren't very good, and it led to oxidation, sludge buildup, and varnish coating everything inside the transmission. So by 1939, that same Earl A. Thompson and his group had developed finally a fluid coupling to go with a fully automatic shifting transmission, the 1940 Hydra-Matic transmission, very similar to this 1953 model that I have sitting right here. So the 1940 Hydra-Matic transmission used a two-element fluid coupling. It just had a turbine and an impeller, and a fully automatic shifting 4-speed transmission behind it. So I had always thought that the first transmission was a 2-speed, but it was not. It was a 4-speed. This one right here, the Hydra-Matic transmission. Now, anytime you have a fluid coupling, it's going to generate heat when there is a difference between the speed of the engine and the speed of the input shaft of the transmission. The heat that was generated by the fluid coupling did not work well at all with motor oils, and so they developed General Motors' first automatic transmission fluid, which really is just oil, but once again they renamed it to fluid so that people would quit putting oil in the transmission. So this is a full can, extremely rare, of General Motors transmission fluid number 1 for the Oldsmobile Hydra-Matic Drive. I can't believe I even found this. I got it off of eBay several years ago, and it's an incredible find. I've never seen one since. So this fluid today would be known as a Group 1 base stock oil. Not a very good quality base stock to begin with. And so it required a number of additives to make it work well with the automatic transmission, the Hydra-Matic transmission. And those additives that they added to the base stock oil back then are trying to accomplish the same things that the additives today are. And that is to prevent corrosion It's to promote proper flow of the fluid under all temperatures. And this fluid did not work very well in really cold temperatures. When it was warm, it was okay, but it had problems when it was cold. When the clutch plates are applied or a band is applied, we want it to hold solid and not slip. The fluid has to act as a hydraulic fluid and a lubrication. It has to be able to transfer heat to the outside of the transmission case. And this original transmission was not cooled. There was no external cooler connected to it initially. Eventually, it was. And it has to have additives to try to maintain the proper viscosity. Now, there's a brochure, as you can see here, for the 1940 Hydra-Matic transmission. And they are claiming this major advancement because they are saying, as you can see here, that the fluid will not thin or thicken for at least 5,000 miles. So, with the automatic safety transmission, they told you to change the oil in the transmission every 10,000 miles and to check it every 1,000 miles. But when they went to this transmission fluid here, because of the fluid coupling added to the transmission, they told you to check it every 1,000 miles, change it at the first 5,000 miles that you came to, and then change it again every 10 to 12,000 miles after that, depending on whether or not it was an Oldsmobile or a Cadillac or what model year it was. But about 10,000 miles is all you got out of that old transmission fluid. Now, this transmission came out in fall of 1939, and the United States was drawn into World War II at the end of 1941. So the U.S. government ordered a shutdown of all automotive manufacturing at the beginning of 1942, and instead the automobile manufacturers and their assembly plants made war equipment to help support the war. And part of the war equipment being produced were tanks. And this Hydra-Matic transmission here was used in certain tanks and other military vehicles in World War II. And as you can see here in these magazine ads, they're claiming that it was battle tested, because this transmission had some growing pains and nothing like heavy-duty severe use in big tanks and other equipment during the war to really prove this transmission reliable or not. And enough changes were made and improvements were made in the transmission that it ended up being a very good transmission. And as I said, it lasted for about 16 years. This can that you see right here is a little bit newer can of the same fluid, Hydra-Matic fluid that I just showed you. This would be from the 1950s fluid for the old Hydra-Matic transmissions. Okay, when World War II ended at the end of 1945, automobile production picked up again, and the automatic transmission seemed to be a hit. A lot of people liked the automatic transmission and how easy it made driving a vehicle. The problem with the original 4-speed Hydra-Matic transmission that we just looked at is that it was a big, expensive 4-speed transmission. And Chevrolet and Buick decided they wanted a transmission that was less expensive. They liked the idea of an automatic transmission, but they wanted one that was less expensive. And for the 1948 model year, Buick came up with the Dynaflow transmission right behind me. This is a 2-speed automatic transmission. The first Dynaflows, you still had to move the shift lever to go from first to second gear, but there was no clutch required, and it was just a flick of the finger to make it shift from first to second gear, but later models shifted automatically. But as you can imagine, with a 2-speed transmission, that doesn't give you a lot of gears for acceleration, and these weren't exactly known for being hard accelerating vehicles, the Buick 2-speed. So to compensate for just having 2 speeds rather than the 4 that the Hydra-Matic had, they had to design a special torque converter. Now, if you remember, the Hydra-Matic only had a fluid coupling, just 2 impellers next to each other. So to compensate for only having 2 gears, Buick engineers came up with a fluid coupling that had an additional part inside of it called the stator. And the stator's job is to multiply engine torque delivered to the input shaft of the automatic transmission. It does not increase the power of the engine, but it increases the power delivered from the engine to the input shaft. Well, this torque converter has 3 stators in it and has a torque multiplication factor of almost 2.6 to 1. So you could take engine torque and multiply it by 2.6 under heavy acceleration conditions and make it feel like it had more than just 2 gears in the automatic transmission as far as how quickly it would accelerate. The problem with this unique torque converter design, though, is that it created even more heat. And that additional heat required a better fluid. So prior to the release of the next fluid specification, the Type A fluid specification that we'll look at here in a moment, the previous fluid, the General Motors Hydra-Matic Transmission fluid for Oldsmobile and for Cadillac, these fluids were only available at Oldsmobile and Cadillac dealers. And Pontiac used it also, and I have not been able to find a can of Pontiac fluid, but they were only available at dealerships. Now, because they were only available at dealerships, when a vehicle owner would bring their vehicle in to have the fluid checked, if it needed fluid, and that service station, gas station, repair garage, whatever it may be, didn't have that fluid, they did have motor oil. And they knew from the instructions in the repair manual and the owner's manual that 20-weight oil could be used temporarily in place of the official GM transmission fluid. But as soon as possible, that 20-weight oil needed to be flushed out and replaced with the proper fluid. Well, that wasn't happening. So instead, motor oil was being poured into the 1940 through 48 Hydra-Matic transmissions rather than the official fluid that it called for. And this was, of course, causing problems, especially cold weather related failures. The fluid, the oil would be too thick, would cause delayed engagements and burned clutches and other issues that are common to cold weather automatic transmissions. So for 1949, General Motors developed an industry-wide Type A fluid specification. And the Type A fluid specification would mean that the fluid would not just be available at General Motors dealerships, but it would also be available at any corner gas station or store anywhere in the country, and it could be sold by other oil manufacturers. So, for example, here's a early can of Texaco Texmatic fluid Type A. This fluid obviously would be available at Texaco gas stations, which were nationwide back then in the 40s. So the 1949 fluid specification had a licensing program, and what that meant is pretty much what it means today. That if somebody like Texaco or Chevron or whomever, Gulf, wants to sell transmission fluid and claim that it will work as whatever specification, the old Hydra-Matic, the Type A, the later ones, the Dexron, and so on, that they have to submit their oil, their fluid, to this independent testing laboratory. And General Motors enlisted the help of the Armor Research Foundation back then. And this foundation would test whoever fluid was sent to them for a price. And it was an expensive set of tests to do. And if the fluid with the proper additives passed the test, that fluid would be issued an Armor Qualification Number. So right here on the top of this fluid can, you can see the letters AQ for Armor Qualification, the company that certified it, ATF for automatic transmission fluid, and then the number 102. This is the second fluid that was certified by the Armor Research Foundation in 1949. find it incredible that I even found an AQ ATF 102. Now, it started with 101, and they only did 2 of them in 1949, 101 and 102. 101 was the General Motors fluid. So from 1949 to 1951, the Type A fluids were available at General Motors dealerships everywhere and any Texaco service station or where Texaco products were sold. And it was an experiment to see how that worked. And then in 1951 and later, they allowed other companies to submit fluids and get qualification numbers. So there were hundreds of other brands of fluids that were licensed and qualified by the Armor Research Center, and they all received the AQ qualification numbers. So here's some Buick, they call it Buick Special Oil, but on the back of the can, in fine print right there, it says Automatic Transmission Fluid Type A. And this is a AQ ATF 195. Gulf sold automatic transmission fluid Type A, it says, and it has a AQ ATF 291 on the top. Delco Type A transmission fluid AQ ATF 396 right there. Mopar Type A AQ ATF 600. So that can of Mopar Type A fluid had a very high license number, the AQ ATF 600. And remember, we started with 101 and 102 right here. So there was no shortage of Type A fluid anywhere in the country, and it spread to many, many countries throughout the world where General Motors products were sold. So starting with 1949, the licensing and testing program was set up with General Motors, and it's been used ever since. It's not the same company doing the qualifying today, but there are companies that are doing that for General Motors. Okay, I forgot to mention on the Type A fluid that the service interval increased to 15,000 miles from the 10,000 or the 12,000 that was used on the previous Hydra-Matic transmission. Now, right behind me here, we have the cast iron Powerglide transmission from Chevrolet. And this came out in 1950. And I told you Chevrolet was looking for a less expensive transmission for their models of vehicles. And Chevrolet also developed a special torque converter for their vehicles. It's this 3-element torque converter right here. And that torque converter design is basically the design of torque converters today, minus the torque converter clutch. It's a 3-element design with a turbine, an impeller, and a stator, a single stator. Now this particular stator is made for high torque multiplication because it's just a 2-speed transmission. The stators used in modern transmissions don't need as much torque multiplication as the 2-speed Powerglide did. By the way, the higher the torque multiplication factor, the less efficient the torque converter can be. And so it takes special designing of the torque converter to make it be both efficient while driving at freeway speeds, highway speeds, which the interstate freeway system did not even exist back when these transmissions were made, and also to give you good acceleration with the proper amount of torque multiplication. By the way, have you ever wondered why low and reverse were right next to each other on the gear selector for an automatic transmission from vehicles from the 1950s and 40s? As I mentioned before, the interstate freeway system was not in existence at the time, and many of the roads were not paved. They were just dirt roads, and it was fairly common to get stuck on a muddy road. And one way to get unstuck was to rock the vehicle forward and backwards. Well, these transmissions were designed to rock forward and backwards. That's why they put low right next to reverse. And in the instructions in the owner's manual and the service information, you could actually do a part throttle shift from low to reverse, and back. Today, if you try to do that, the computer will block you out and won't let the shift complete. But back then, they were designed to do that, to try to rock the vehicle out of being stuck. A little bit of trivia there. By the way, the 1950 and above Chevrolet 2-speed Powerglide transmission with that torque converter caused so much heat and oxidation, which is air mixing in with the fluid and reacting with chemicals in the fluid and materials in the transmission. It caused the need for a revision in the Type A fluid specification. That revision took place in 1951. Okay, so up to this point we've seen three fluids. The regular motor oil from the automatic safety transmission, the Hydra-Matic Drive fluid from the original 4-speed Hydra-Matic, and now the Type A fluid for the 2-speed transmissions that were developed in the late 40s, early 50s. Now let's move on to the next generation of technologies that caused the fluid to change several times in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, right behind me here we have the second generation 4-speed Hydra-Matic transmission. The second generation transmission was supposed to be an improvement over the first one, because the first one had a problem of a very harsh 2-3 upshift and 3-2 downshift. And the problem resulted from having to release a clutch pack at the same time as applying a band. And if you didn't get the timing correct, if you applied the band before the clutch pack was totally released, it would cause a binding action that would feel like and give you a hard, harsh shift from second to third or third back to second. And so in an attempt to remedy that situation, they came up with a unique design, and this transmission is called the controlled coupling Hydra-Matic transmission. And I want to show you the controlled coupling. This is the controlled coupling. And if you look at it, it looks like a little miniature fluid coupling, and that's because it is. So this fluid coupling takes the place of the clutch pack that had to be released, that the band would then grab to go from second to third gear on that first transmission. So this fluid coupling was in addition to the regular fluid coupling back here that it had in the front of the transmission. So this thing had two fluid couplings inside of it. And so, of course, heat buildup could go much higher, and these things could run really hot. They were finally externally cooled. They had cooling lines that went to an external heat exchanger that was liquid cooled by the engine's coolant. So the controlled coupling Hydra-Matic transmission, it gave some smooth shifts, but it was a very complex automatic transmission. So because of the extra heat generated by having two fluid couplings, as well as the air that was being mixed in with the transmission fluid promoting oxidation, and the foaming that was taking place, a new fluid was required that had additional additives to address the foaming and the oxidation and other things that were taking place. So this new fluid was called Type A Suffix A fluid. Type A Suffix A fluid. So if you look at the cans of fluid from that period, they still say Type A on a lot of them, but on the top of the can, now that they have the armor qualification number, notice this one is an AQ ATF 696 and then the A at the end. It has an A suffix. That is the Type A Suffix A fluid that you may have never heard of, or you may have seen it on some one-size-fits-all fluids that are sold at auto parts stores today. And so everyone, including Texaco, who wanted to sell the new fluid would have to have that fluid tested to make sure that it met the manufacturer requirements. And the fluids that did had the Type A Suffix A license number on them. So here's a the can of Texaco fluid from the Texas company. That was their name before they switched to Texaco. Here's a can with the same number after they switched company names to Texaco Incorporated. Here's a can of Mobil. They call it Mobil fluid, automatic transmission fluid. Notice it is a Type A, Suffix A, AQ ATF 752A. So for Mobil. Here's Cadillac's Type A, Suffix A fluid. It's really hard to read, but it says AQ ATF 775A in the rusty lid. Okay, the next transmission technology that was developed was the 1957 through 1962 Chevrolet Turboglide transmission. And as you can see, I've got one here behind me. The Turboglide transmission was a unique transmission in that it was basically an infinitely variable ratio transmission. This does not have a valve body. It does not have shift valves. It does not shift. Instead, it has a very unique torque converter. And this torque converter has 3 turbines with 3 input shafts. And each input shaft is connected to a different part of 2 different planetary gear sets inside of this. They call it a 3-ratio transmission, but it's much more than 3 ratios. It has a minimum gear ratio, like a low gear ratio, and it has a maximum gear ratio, like the overdrive or direct drive that an automatic transmission would have. But this transmission, as the engine speeds up and the vehicle speed increases, it changes which turbine is most effective, and it has a variable pitch stator inside of it. The vanes on the stator, the angle of the vanes on the stator can be varied in 2 positions on this one. There's another model that they're variable in more than 2 positions, and it will cause what today, if you've ever driven a vehicle with a continuously variable transmission, this transmission, I understand, would drive just like that. No shifts, which is one customer complaint that I've heard of, is that people didn't like it because they couldn't feel it shifting. But it really was a very unique design, well ahead of its time, that would allow the engine to rev up to a certain point and give you maximum power, and then it would accelerate at whatever rate was determined by the pitch of the blades on the turbines and the stator. But that thing got hot. It got really hot. It got so hot it cracked the case on many transmissions, and it was basically a massive failure. It didn't work very well. It was not widely accepted and was only used from 1957 through 1962, when it was replaced with the aluminum Chevrolet Powerglide, or General Motors Powerglide, at that time. But that transmission and the 3rd generation Hydra-Matic right behind my head here caused so much heat to be developed that the transmission fluid spec had to be revised. The Type A, Suffix A fluid was revised 3 times, one in 1958, right after the release of this transmission, one in 1959, and one in 1960. And I have examples of some Buick oil that are Type A, Suffix A, with the AQ ATF 1716A, so 1,716 licenses. So really widespread use of the fluid. Here's Texaco AQ ATF 1735A. Here's some General Motors Type A, Suffix A fluid, and it is AQ ATF 2882A, and that was one of the last ones licensed. It was around the 3,000 mark that the Suffix A fluids ended. Now, just like today, there were fluids back then that are either counterfeit or misleading. And I want to show you two of them from the 50s. This one right here is from a company called Warco. And if you look at the can here, it says automatic transmission fluid. And then on the top, it's kind of hard to read because it's rusty, but it reads WLCO-ATF 334 Suffix A. So instead of the AQ ATF and then a number suffix A, this says WLCO-ATF and then a number suffix A. So to an unsuspecting consumer, this untested, unlicensed fluid might look like, hey, that's the good fluid to get. And I suspect, I don't know, that this fluid was a lot less money than the licensed fluid because it seriously costs a lot of money to have your fluid tested to make sure that it passed all of the qualification tests required to be a licensed and GM approved transmission fluid. So there are companies out there that say, let's just shortcut that. These people were obviously trying to fraudulently trick the public, but I've found a few cans out there like that. It has a patent number on the side. You look up that patent, it's for the container that the fluid is in, not for the fluid itself. All right, then here's another very interesting can of fluid, and it also is a non-approved fluid. I want you to notice that it has RL ATF 2767, and it's called Red Label. And on the back it says automatic transmission fluid suffix A, and it tells you which transmissions it'll work with. And so this is a counterfeit fluid. This is not a GM licensed type A suffix A fluid, but this fluid, I think, drove a transition in transmission fluids. I'm going to read you what it says here on the back. A special red additive has been added for instant leak detection. Red Label ATF is specifically recommended as a supplemental fluid to restore transmission fluid level to full capacity in newly rebuilt transmissions or when refilling a transmission completely. It is recommended to add at least 2 cans of good conditioner. So this basically is a red dye fluid. So remember, I told you at the start of this series that transmission fluids were not red until a certain point. Well, the aftermarket fluids appear to have come up with the idea to have red fluids, because in the next fluid after type A suffix A, which is the original Dexron fluid, in the fluid specifications for that fluid, it doesn't require it, but it recommends that the fluid color be red to aid in leak detection. It wasn't until Dexron II that they actually required the red color that is still there today for General Motors and many other fluid specifications for automatic transmissions. Okay, engineers at General Motors weren't done experimenting with different types of automatic transmissions. For the 1961 model year, they released the 3rd generation Hydra-Matic transmission. So we had the first one in 1940, the second one in 1957, the controlled coupling one, and now we have this 3-speed instead of a 4-speed Hydra-Matic transmission. Now, this also ended up driving the need for better fluids. And the unique thing about this transmission is that it does not use the traditional torque converter. It has what looks like a manual transmission flywheel and a torque damper, much like you would see on a manual transmission clutch disc. This torque damper would slide onto the input shaft of the automatic transmission right here. And that was the connection. There was no torque converter between the input shaft and the back of the engine crankshaft. However, inside of the transmission in this little bulge area right here is this little mini torque converter. And it was a 3-element torque converter with a variable pitch stator, and it was pretty small. And it also would develop a lot of heat and had oxidation and other problems that drove the need for an even better fluid. Now, by the 1960s, oil refining had improved. The Group 1 base stock oil that all of these transmission fluids have been comprised of, along with additives being added up to this point, was refined with something called solvent refining and dewaxing. But a new process called hydrotreating would help make the transmission fluid more stable to where it was less prone to oxidation. Now, I am not a chemist and I don't claim to know everything about transmission fluids. I'm just looking at the history of these fluids. So don't ask me all the chemical questions here of how things work. But from what I understand, it stabilized the fluid. There are carbon-hydrogen chains that were unstable, that by passing hydrogen through there, it would make them even more stable. So the fluid would be a better fluid and last longer. And those improvements led to a new fluid in 1967 called Dexron. So let's take a look at the Dexron fluid. Okay, before we talk about the Dexron automatic transmission fluids, we need to talk about a pivotal moment in automatic transmission fluid history, and I call it the big divergence. And that is in 1959, Ford decided they were going to develop their own automatic transmission fluid standards and not use the General Motors standards any longer. So I will have a separate video on the history of Ford automatic transmission fluids. But 1959 is when they split off from using General Motors Type A and Type A Suffix A automatic transmission fluids in their transmissions. One other historical development in the early 60s, in 1963, Toyota released their first automatic transmission, the 2-speed Powerglide transmission, and it also used the GM Type A Suffix A fluid, and I will have a separate video on the history of Toyota automatic transmission fluids coming up. Also, another pivotal year is 1964. Two important things happened in 1964. One, General Motors quit using divisional branded or built automatic transmissions. There was no more Buick transmission. There was no more Chevrolet transmission. There was no more Cadillac transmission. Everything was just simply General Motors, and it was used in all divisions of General Motors from that point forward. So the first corporate automatic transmission used in all GM lines in 1964 was the Hydra-Matic 400. Also in 1964, Chrysler starts producing their own automatic transmission fluid specifications, and I will have a separate video on the history of Chrysler automatic transmission fluids coming up. Now in 1966, General Motors released a few more corporate transmissions. We had a front-wheel drive version of the Turbo 400, as well as heavier versions and lighter versions of the Turbo 400. And all of these transmissions were 3 speeds and used the Type A Suffix A fluid. Okay, in April of 1967, General Motors released the first Dexron. Notice there's no Dexron 2 or 3 or anything else after it. It's just plain Dexron automatic transmission fluid. And yes, it is spelled D-E-X-R-O-N. There's no T in there. It is not Dextron. It's Dexron automatic transmission fluid. And of course, there was a licensing program for this fluid specification. The licensing numbers began with the letter B, and this was the very first one right here, B10001, a pretty rare can of transmission fluid right here. This particular can was made November of 1968. Notice on the back of the can here, it tells us that there are great improvements in this automatic transmission fluid. One of those improvements is a 24,000 mile fluid change interval now. And it tells us it has non-foaming action qualities for year-round use, for passenger cars and light trucks, high heat resistance, anti-oxidation, and it's not for use in engines. So just like the previous licensing programs and testing programs from General Motors to make sure that the fluid meets the specifications required by GM, there was a licensing program. So here's a can of Texaco Hydra-Matic fluid. It has its license number right on the front, B0101. This can also, interestingly enough, has a Type A Suffix A AQ ATF 2865A marking on the top. And it tells us on the back of this can, it tells us that this Texaco Hydra-Matic fluid is recommended for use in automatic transmissions and power steering units where either Dexron or an AQ ATF Type A Suffix A fluid is specified. And this can is even older than the other one. This is 10 of 1967. And remember the spec was issued in April of 1967. So this is a very early can of the fluid with, well, it looks like it's 100 numbers higher than the GM one that I have right here with the license number of 10,001. This is 10,101. Okay. You could get the fluid in much larger containers. Here's a Dexron can, license number B11424. By the way, the B for in the Dexron this is a Type B fluid. So we had Type A fluid and a Type A Suffix A. This is a Type B. So the original Dexron is Dexron B, and then the next Dexron is Dexron 2C and 2D and so on. We'll take a look at that here in just a moment. So in 1969, General Motors released the Hydra-Matic 180, another 3-speed transmission, but this one just used a regular 3-element torque converter with no fancy or weird torque converter designs like we've seen out of the 50s and the early 60s. So in 1971, improvements in oil refining, specifically a process called hydrocracking, ended up producing a better quality base oil. And because of this improvement in base oil qualities, a new fluid specification came out in 1973 called Dexron II. So here's a can of Dexron II automatic transmission fluid. Remember I told you that the original Dexrons had license number beginning with the letter B. Well, the Dexron 2s began with a license number beginning with the letter C. So this is a C20109. So it begins with a C-2 instead of a B-1. So the Dexron 2C fluid came out in 1973 and was used until 1978. When it was discovered that this fluid was promoting corrosion inside of automatic transmission fluid coolers. So General Motors revised the specifications and changed the licensing to where the fluid license numbers now had to begin with the letter D. In 1974, a significant event occurred in the production of base oils, and that is the production of the first synthetic base oils, the PAO, polyalpha olefins based oils, were first produced in 1974, and they were used in motor oil, and they were marketed under the Mobil 1 oil brand, and they still are today. But it was not until 1989 that Mobil came up with the first fully synthetic automatic transmission fluid, the Mobil 1 automatic transmission fluid. Now today there are still fully synthetic automatic transmission fluids available, and we'll take a look at some of those coming up. But the first time any PAO-based synthetic automatic transmission fluid was available was 1989. So here's a can of Delco Dexron II fluid. It has a license number of D2002. So this is Dexron 2D. And the D doesn't mean Dexron, that's just, we had Type A, Type B was the original Dexron, Type C, that promoted cooler corrosion, and now Type D fluid is the next Dexron out there. So Type D fluid came out in 1978. Here's a can of it from Valvoline, the Hydra-Matic fluid. Notice it says right on top of it, it's a Type D fluid. They were real big about advertising that this was not the Type C fluid. This has a license number of D20884. And here's a can of Texaco Tex-Matic Dexron II that has a license number of D21058. So, up to this point, we have seen 3 different Dexrons. The original Dexron B, the Dexron 2C, and the Dexron 2D. So in that time period, General Motors released a few more 3-speed transmissions. We had the Hydra-Matic 200, the Hydra-Matic 250. In 1978, we had the front-wheel drive 325 Hydra-Matic. And then we had, in 1979, another technology changer, the torque converter clutch. So as a result of the 1973 Arab oil embargo, the very first government corporate average fuel economy ratings, CAFE ratings, were established and had to begin in 1978. So one of the ways to improve fuel economy was to get an overdrive transmission, go to a 4-speed overdrive, and to get rid of the slipping inside of the torque converter by installing what's called a torque converter clutch. And the torque converter clutches back then would lock the engine's crankshaft to the input shaft of the automatic transmission while you're driving down the road at a steady speed. And it would improve fuel economy because normally you would have a slip or a speed difference of 200 or 300 RPM. A whole new batch of technologies had to be invented to meet these corporate average fuel economy standards. So for the 1979 model year, General Motors released 2 transmissions with a torque converter clutch. They were existing versions of the Hydra-Matic 200 and the 250, but they put the letter C after their designation to indicate that it had a torque converter clutch. Now there were no computer controls involved, it was just simply pressure switches and a brake switch involved in activating and deactivating the torque converter clutch. In 1980, they developed a front-wheel drive version of a transmission, a 3-speed with a converter clutch. It was called the 125, later known as the 3T40 transaxle. In 1981, they added a torque converter clutch to the Hydra-Matic 350. That transmission came out in the mid-1960s. In 1982, they came up with another transmission called the 204R, which was a 4-speed overdrive transmission with a torque converter clutch. Also in 1982, they released the 325 4L with a torque converter clutch. This was the front-wheel drive transmission that went in vehicles like the Oldsmobile Toronado and other front-wheel drive GM vehicles. And then also in 1982, they released the ill-fated 700R4 transmission with the torque converter clutch. And then in 1984, they released a 4-speed front-wheel drive transaxle, which is the grandfather of this 4T65E here behind me, behind my left shoulder. It was called the 440T4. And all of these had torque converter clutches. In the mid-1980s, General Motors was experimenting with electronically shifted and controlled automatic transmissions. There was a Cadillac F7 front-wheel drive transmission. There were some import vehicles that had electric shift transmissions. The Chevrolet Sprint 3-speed was an electric shifted transmission and so on. But it wasn't until 1991 that this transmission right here, the 4L80E, was released and was widely used, not just in a single car, experimental car, but widely used in pickup trucks. And this 4L80E is a combination of the old Turbo 400 transmission with an overdrive unit in front of it. And it's electronically controlled. It has 2 shift solenoids and a pressure control solenoid and a torque converter clutch solenoid. There are 4 solenoids in this transmission. And because of the changes in adding these extra electronics and the need to have fluid flowing through the solenoids at a proper rate under all temperature ranges, a new transmission fluid specification was released by General Motors in October of 1992. And this was the Dexron II fluid specification. Now, I could not find a bottle or can of Dexron II anywhere in the last 3 years of searching. If you know where I can get one, let me know. But I can't find it. They've disappeared. In 1993, another significant event occurred in the production of base stock oils, and that is the production of what we now call Group 3 base oils. Group 3 base oils are still refined crude oil, but they're highly refined to where they're very clean, very pure. They don't react with other chemicals and oxygen as easily as the Group 2 base oils did, and they have a much higher viscosity index than the Group 2 base oils. Now, to my knowledge, there are no Group 3 base oils that are used primarily as the base oil for automatic transmission fluids. Instead, the Group 3 base oil is blended with Group 2 base oils to come up with whatever viscosity index the vehicle manufacturer desires. They can also mix in Group 4 or Group 5 base oils to come up with the desired viscosity index. So the Group 3 base oil was developed in 1993. That is the same year that the American Petroleum Institute, the API, came up with this table of base stock categories that we refer to today. Also in the 1990s, a better refining method for the Group 2 base oils was developed, and it's called hydro-treating. And the hydro-treating cleaned up and helped stabilize the base 2 oils to where their viscosity index would be at the higher range of the base 2 oil group rather than the mid-range or the lower range. They were at the higher range. And this new method of refining led to an unofficial API group called the Group 2 Plus base oils. Now, the development of the Group 2 Plus base oils was occurring at the same time that General Motors made some big changes in their automatic transmission fluids and the service intervals for changing that fluid. So right in between the Dexron II fluid specification that was used in our 1991 4L80E transmission there, and the next fluid specification, the Dexron 3F transmission fluid, was this change in refining methods to produce what is called the Group 2 Plus base stock oils. So in 1995, General Motors changed their fluid fill specification to a Dexron 3 rather than 2 with the F as the suffix at the end. So Dexron 3F. And I have a technical service bulletin from General Motors here from March of 1995 describing the Dexron 3F fluid. General Motors has phased in a new automatic transmission fluid, the Dexron 3, that does not need replacing under normal service. Dexron 3 is designed to help deliver the best possible performance under all conditions. The improvements in Dexron 3 include better friction stability, more high-temperature oxidation stability, and better material compatibility. Dexron 3 has the same low-temperature fluidity as Dexron II for better transmission performance in cold weather. Dexron II and Dexron 3 are fully compatible. Dexron 3 is fully compatible with any General Motors vehicle or light truck with an automatic transmission built since 1949. And remember, 1949 was the very first year for the Type A fluid specification. Now, the stuff about Dexron 3 and all these later ones never needing their fluid changed, that's under what they call normal conditions. Well, normal conditions is not the normal everyday driving of me. I drive to work and back every day, but I don't drive under what they define as normal conditions in the maintenance guide. So you need to read the maintenance guide. Here are their fluid change recommendations from this service bulletin. The 1995 transmission fluid change intervals will be the following. 1994 and prior should use the schedules as written in the owner's manual. If the vehicle is mainly driven under one or more of the following conditions: in heavy traffic where the outside temperature reaches 90 degrees or higher Fahrenheit, in hilly or mountainous terrain, when towing a trailer, when found in uses such as taxi, police car, or delivery service. For vehicles over 8,600 gross vehicle weight rating, change the fluid and filter every 50,000 miles. If the vehicle is not used mainly under any of these conditions, the fluid and filter do not require periodic changing for vehicles under 8,600 GVWR. So the service interval for Dexron III fluid is every 50,000 miles for a large majority of the drivers out there. Now, the change to the Dexron III automatic transmission fluid, I believe, was just a natural progression as the refining methods for base stock oil improved and the oil itself improved. But there was also a new technology on the horizon coming up for the 1997 model year transmissions. And I've got the very first transmission here behind me that has what's called an electronically controlled clutch capacity torque converter clutch. So the ECCC. And what that means is instead of the torque converter clutch applying solidly and connecting the back of the engine's crankshaft to the input shaft of the transmission, it's going to allow for some slip between the two. Now, not the normal amount of slip that you would get with a fully released torque converter of 200-300 RPM while driving down the road, depending on how heavy your vehicle is. This slip would be controlled somewhere between approximately 20 RPM and 80 RPM. And if it ever fell outside of those ranges while applied, it would set a trouble code. So the reason that we went to the ECC slipping style torque converter clutch was to help avoid engine misfire trouble codes, the P0300 style trouble codes. And OBD2 regulations require that the PCM or ECM for the engine monitor for engine misfire conditions. And it monitors that by watching the normal crankshaft rotational fluctuations as you drive. Well, with a torque converter clutch that is solidly locked and engaged, every time you accelerate or decelerate the vehicle, it would affect those normal crankshaft rotations and possibly trigger a false P0300 trouble code. So to avoid that situation, they allow the torque converter clutch to slip with a controlled amount of slip, so the controlled capacity, the electronic controlled clutch capacity, was their method in 1997, and they are still using it today. Not just General Motors, but almost everyone is using this method of slipping the torque converter clutch to avoid the P0300 style trouble codes. But this slipping of the torque converter clutch caused some unique problems. One of the problems is a shudder problem, where as it would apply and release, or even while it was holding, it would cause a shuddering, a vibration. And they've been modifying transmission fluids and their additives ever since then, trying to get rid of that. So the original transmission fluid spec for this 4T65E front-wheel drive transaxle, here in 1997 model year, the fluid specification began with Dexron 3F. But because of the shuddering, they went to the Dexron 3G fluid specification in 1998 to try to correct a lot of this shuddering. In the year 2000, General Motors released two 5-speed transmissions. The Allison 1000 5-speed transmission for the 2001 model year 2500 and 3500 series trucks, and then the 5L40E 5-speed transmission for some Cadillacs and other lighter weight passenger cars. These 5-speed transmissions improved fuel economy and helped reduce vehicle emissions. Then in 2003, General Motors revised the Dexron 3 fluid specification again. So we started with Dexron 3F, and then we went to a G. The fluid specification next went to a Dexron 3H. The Dexron 3H fluid specification stayed in effect for automatic transmission use until 2011 when General Motors inactivated that specification. Then in 2016, GM came up with another revision of the Dexron 3 fluid, the Dexron 3K fluid. So this is the H, but you need to be aware that that fluid is no longer for automatic transmissions. The only reason they re-released the Dexron 3 fluid is that there are manual transmissions out there and power steering systems that still require Dexron 3 fluid. So what they have done is they've removed the additive package that made it suitable for use in automatic transmissions. And now it's just for manual transmissions that require it, and not all of them do, and some power steering systems. So be warned, there's Dexron 3K fluid out there that is not for automatic transmissions. Okay, the next significant change in General Motors automatic transmission fluid history took place in the year 2005. In 2005, General Motors released the Dexron 6J automatic transmission fluid specification. The Dexron 6 fluid specification was for a new series of 6-speed automatic transmissions co-developed by General Motors and Ford. We have the rear-wheel drive 6L80 right here that came out in the 2006 Chevrolet Corvette and has been used subsequently in pickup trucks and other rear-wheel drive passenger cars by General Motors. I believe the equivalent of this that came out a few years later in Ford was the 6R140. Now, the initial release of the Dexron 6 automatic transmission fluid here, it does not say on the back of the bottle or anywhere on here that it is a fully synthetic fluid. And it was revised again in 2013. And on the 2013 bottle of Dexron 6, it says right on the back of it that Dexron 6 is a fully synthetic automatic transmission fluid. Now, both of these bottles on the back say that they are backwards compatible with Dexron 3 and 3H. It also says in all applications except power steering and manual transmissions. So the Dexron 6 fluid is not backwards compatible with Dexron fluids and the Type A and the Type A Suffix A and all that clear back to 1949. It's only going back to the Dexron 3H. That makes me think that the Dexron 3H fluid is a much higher quality fluid than I had first suspected. Now, the very next model year, the 2007 model year, the Dexron 6 fluid was also used in a front-wheel drive transaxle co-developed by General Motors and Ford called the 6T70 in General Motors vehicles, the 6F50 in Ford vehicles. Ford had their own version of this fluid they called the Mercon LV. Now, a word about aftermarket fluids for automatic transmissions. I have 3 different bottles of transmission fluid here from various stores. This particular bottle right here is from O'Reilly Auto Parts, and it says right on the front of it that it's compatible for use in General Motors and Ford transmissions. But then it says meets Dexron 3H specs in little tiny letters. See the back panel for specific applications. So on the back panel here, it tells us that this high-quality product is suitable for use in all General Motors and Ford automatic transmissions calling for Dexron 3G and H. So Dexron 3H is a 2003 and earlier specification. It also says it's compatible with Dexron 2E, 2D, and 2, as well as Mercon Type CJ and Type A Suffix A fluid from 1958. So in other words, this transmission fluid that states that it's compatible with General Motors and Ford transmissions, that's true, but only if you have a 2003 or earlier vehicle. This Proline automatic transmission fluid that I got from Pep Boys, I believe, pretty much says the exact same thing on the back. This bottle of Mobil 1 fully synthetic transmission fluid that I just bought a couple of weeks ago is telling you the same thing on the back. The Mobil 1 synthetic ATF multi-vehicle formula is recommended by ExxonMobil, not by General Motors, for use in applications requiring Dexron, Dexron 3H, Dexron 3G, Dexron 2E, 2D, 2, and a few other manufacturer specifications. So, in other words, this bottle of fully synthetic Mobil 1 ATF is still not a Dexron 6 compatible fluid, and it says right on it, not recommended for applications requiring Mercon LV, Mercon SP, or Dexron 6. So a 2003 model year and older is what this fluid was made for. So buyer beware. They're not lying to you, but you need to read the fine print, and you need to understand when these fluid specifications even came about, because you pour the wrong fluid in your transmission and it can affect how it operates and the life of that transmission. And it won't necessarily cause a failure today, tomorrow, next week, next month. It might cause a failure a couple of years down the road that might be several years sooner than it should have been with the proper fluid. For the 2011 model year, General Motors released the Chevrolet Volt plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. And that vehicle came with the 4ET50 transaxle. This was a 4-mode electric transaxle. And this hybrid electric transaxle requires the Dexron 6 automatic transmission fluid as well. So this system runs on up to 400 volts while you're driving. And so obviously automatic transmission fluids must be non-conductive for the system to work properly. Any incorrect fluids or additives put into these transaxles could cause a loss of isolation of the high voltage, which could damage the transaxle or shut the vehicle down and prevent it from moving. For the 2016 model year, General Motors released the Chevrolet Volt second generation, and that model came with a 5ET50 transaxle, a 5-mode hybrid electric transaxle. By the way, the 5th mode added was a power split mode, much like the Toyota hybrid system. And that transaxle also requires the Dexron 6 automatic transmission fluid. In July of 2013, General Motors released the Dexron HP fluid specification. The Dexron HP fluid is a full synthetic automatic transmission fluid. It says right on the back of it that it is a PAO-based fluid. And this fluid release was for the upcoming 2015 model year 8-speed rear-wheel drive transmissions that General Motors had developed. So we have the 8L90 and there's also an 8L45. Now this transmission fluid, although it's made from a PAO synthetic base oil, it has an additive package that is necessary for this transmission fluid to operate properly. Well, what happened with these 8-speed transmissions is that the torque converter clutch is one of those electric control clutch capacity type torque converter clutches that slip all the time, and they were having a shuttering problem. And because of the shuttering problem, they did a revision to the Dexron HP fluid specification, and now they call for Mobil 1, but not just any Mobil 1 automatic transmission fluid. This has to be Mobil 1 synthetic LV for low viscosity ATF HP, and it has to have this Dexron license logo on the front of it. Now, by comparison, this bottle of synthetic ATF does not have HP on it. It does not have the Dexron fluid logo or license on it, and it says nothing about Dexron HP, yet they're both PAO-based base fluids. So the difference between these two is this one does not have the proper additive package for the 8-speed transmission torque converter clutch shutter issue. This one does. So just because it's a synthetic base oil transmission fluid doesn't mean that it's this wonderful fluid that's going to solve all your problems. It has to have the right additive package with it. So there are two Dexron HP fluids, the original version and then the newest version, the synthetic LV ATF HP, that you were supposed to go in and totally flush out everything from this transmission, get it all out of the torque converter and the entire transmission, and then replace that with this Mobil 1. Now, both of the bottles of Dexron HP fluid here say on the back that it's compatible with earlier versions of Dexron fluid. That is incorrect. It is not compatible with earlier versions of Dexron fluid. They made a whole bunch of these with the wrong information on the label. Even the Mobil 1 fluid says that it can be used with vehicles specifying Dexron 6, 2, or 3 type fluids. Well, there's a service bulletin from General Motors saying that is incorrect. Only use this in the 8-speed transmission and other transmissions that it may be called for, and that it is not compatible with the previous versions. So another transmission that it would be compatible with is the 2017 and above Chevrolet Bolt EV. It has a gear reducer so that the electric motor spins much faster than the tires. That gear reducer needs the Dexron HP fluid. Okay, in January of 2014, Ford released the Mercon ULV automatic transmission fluid specification. Now, this is for the new 10-speed transmission, the Ford 10R80 and the GM 10L90 transmission, which is a jointly developed automatic transmission, rear-wheel drive, just like they did back in 2006 for the 2007 model year. There's also a 9-speed front-wheel drive transaxle that we've got in a Chevrolet Traverse over here that is a joint venture to be used by Ford and General Motors. And so Ford, what seems to be the primary developer based on the documents for the fluid specification of the 10-speed transmission, and GM seems to be the primary developer of the 9-speed transaxle. As far as the ULV fluid is concerned, ULV stands for ultra low viscosity. So here's the bottle of Mercon ULV. Here's the bottle of Dexron ULV. And if you look, they're identical bottles. This one's obviously black, where this one's kind of an orangish color, but obviously out of the same producer. But whether it's Dexron ULV for the General Motors 10-speed or Mercon ULV for the Ford 10-speed, it's the same fluid specification. So for this new 10-speed transmission, this is the only fluid that is compatible with it. The application of the clutches, the operation of all the pulse width modulated solenoids, the torque converter clutch engagement and slipping and control, everything was calibrated for this ULV fluid. Now, in my research and downloading or purchasing and downloading of the Ford specification for the ULV, it does not indicate that it is a full synthetic fluid. As a matter of fact, in the MSDS, the Material Safety Data Sheet for this fluid, it indicates that it is a hydro-treated light paraffinic, which is a crude oil-based base oil. So this is not a fully synthetic fluid. Okay, the Dexron ULV fluid indicates on the back that it's specifically designed for use in 10-speed transmissions, and it is not a suitable replacement for Dexron 3 or Dexron 6. Now, it doesn't mention Dexron HP in there, but that kind of gets to the point I'm trying to make here. So this 10-speed transmission came out for the 2017 model year, and it was 1937 that the first General Motors automatic safety transmission came out for the 1938 model year. And hopefully you can see through all the fluids and the technological changes that have taken place through all the years here in this video that the base fluid is one thing and that the additives to make it work with that transmission properly are another thing. And so I don't see why anyone would want to use anything different than what the original factory fluid called for, or whatever the revision has been since then. If I bought a brand new vehicle and wanted it to work the same way that it always has, I would want to have the same parts in it, and I would use the same fluids, and I would highly recommend that. Now, I know that there are those out there who might disagree with that, and they like a certain brand of fluid, and they've put it in their car and they've never had any problems yet. And maybe they won't, maybe they will. But once again, the base stock oil, being synthetic or non-synthetic or Group 3 Plus or whatever it may be, is just a piece of that puzzle. It's the additives and the electronic controls, the programming of the solenoids in the transmission or transaxle to make that transmission work as it should. The compatibility with the seals and the plastics and the nylons and the clutch packs and bands on the older transmissions, the anti-foaming, the anti-corrosion, the anti-shuttering, and all the other issues that can be unique to a specific transmission are addressed with those additives. Now, as we wrap up this episode on the history of General Motors automatic transmission fluids, I told you in the introductory video that I would tell you where you could find the fluid specifications. There's a website. It's global.ihs.com, and this is a website for a company that's been in business since 1959, and they distribute factory specifications for fluids and other things for several different vehicle manufacturers. There are some vehicle manufacturers that don't share their transmission fluid specifications, and that's because they don't license their fluids to the aftermarket. They're dealer-only fluids, like the original Hydra-Matic Drive fluids for the 1940 Hydra-Matic. You can only get those at a dealership. There is no compatible, there is no authorized or licensed replacement fluid for that. Another place you can find fluid specifications is on the Society of Automotive Engineers website. If you log in and do a search for any name of transmission fluid, you will find technical papers written by people when that standard first came out. And a lot of times they will have the full specifications. They won't have the testing procedures in there, which make the whole document almost 100 pages long on some of these fluid specifications. There's the specifications, which are 20 to 30, 35 different specifications, but then there's the testing procedures of how do you test that fluid to make sure that it meets the 20 to 35 specifications. I told you that we would find out when transmission fluid turned red. And as we saw, there were aftermarket additives, dyes, to turn that fluid red in the 50s and 60s, and it wasn't until Dexron II that it was an actual requirement that it be red for General Motors transmission fluids. We looked at the service intervals for fluids. We saw that we started around 5,000 miles, went to 10, 12, 24,000, 50,000, 100,000, and the supposed lifetime fluid. If you read in the maintenance guide of your owner's manual or that came with the owner's manual on your vehicle, typically it will have two service schedules. One of them for what they call normal driving, which, as we've discussed already, hardly anyone does normal driving because it does not include city driving. And then it has what is considered severe service or rough duty intervals, which is typically about half of what the so-called normal service intervals are. There are also many technical service bulletins issued by each vehicle manufacturer talking about the upgrades in the fluid specifications over the years. So if you have access to TSBs, technical service bulletins for different vehicle manufacturers, then you can look those up for that particular fluid. I also told you that we would look at the technological changes that drove the fluids to change, and there were many technological changes. We also saw and learned that there are many regulatory changes in the law for fuel economy and tailpipe emissions to make transmissions more efficient so parts can rotate more efficiently. I've read articles and received all kinds of comments from people that think that fluid, this ultra low viscosity fluid, is too thin, and that they know better than the factory and they're going to put this other fluid in their transmission instead. And all I can say is good luck. There was actually a technical service bulletin from Ford that I will show you in the history of Ford automatic transmission fluids, where a government fleet's police cars could not reach the top vehicle speed that they used to be able to reach after a transmission service. And they traced it to the fluid being the incorrect fluid being put in during service. So having the wrong fluid in the transmission physically slowed the vehicle from reaching its top speed, which is quite incredible. It makes you wonder what else it's preventing, or what else it's causing, what extra wear or malfunctions that it's leading to prematurely, or things that never would have happened with the proper fluid in them. This video was extra long because it covered 80 years of history. The upcoming videos won't need to be that long because they don't cover as many years of history, and they use General Motors fluids in their transmissions until they develop their own transmission specifications. This transmission fluid history project has been very fun for me to gather all of the different fluid cans and bottles that I've been able to find and to do the research. It's taken a lot longer than I ever expected. It's just about 3 years now to put all of this together, because I wanted to do more than just have some chart to show you. I wanted to show you the actual cans of fluid and the transmissions that go with them. I was unable to find every transmission I wanted, but I was able to find enough to make this video very long, but hopefully somewhat informative and educational to you. Okay, well, it's been an interesting 80 years of transmission fluid history for General Motors. We've got at least 3 more videos coming up: the history of Ford transmission fluids, Chrysler transmission fluids, and Toyota transmission fluids. I've had a lot of requests for Honda transmission fluid information, and I'll try to find information on that. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.